Namaskar. In this lesson, we are going to study about consequences of migration. Migration in India is not new, and historical accounts show that people have moved in search of work in response to environmental shocks and stresses, to escape religious persecution and political conflict. However, improved communications, transport networks, conflicts over natural resources and new economic opportunities have created unprecedented levels of mobility. Although significant in recent years, growth has been unequal in India, characterized by industry in developed states such as Gujarat, Maharashtra and Punjab drawing labour from agriculturally backward and poor regions such as eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, southern Madhya Pradesh, western Orissa and southern Rajasthan. High productivity agricultural areas continue to be important destinations, but rural urban migration is the fastest growing type of migration as more migrants choose to work in better paying non-farm occupations in urban areas and industrial zones. Migration is an important feature of human civilization. It reflects human endeavour to survive in the most testing conditions, both natural and man-made. Migration in India is in existence historically, but in the context of neoliberal globalization assumes special significance for trade unions and civil society. In the last 200 years, the pace of human migration has increased as industrial development has been increasingly concentrated in locations which enjoyed specific economic or physical advantage. Migration has had and continues to have a major impact on human societies. The effects of migration are seen in both the societies that people live, they are called as sending societies, and those in which they settle, and they are called as receiving societies. These societies are not always countries or nations. People may, for instance, move from a rural society such as a village to an urban one such as a city within the same country. The impacts of these internal moves may be as serious for villages as international movements are for nations. The impacts of migration are now so important that an academic discipline has developed around the study of human movement. Those who study migration distinguish between different consequences of human movement. They distinguish between the consequences for the societies which migrants leave and those in which they settle. This can be done by calculating the costs and benefits for both the sending and the receiving societies. This is quite a complicated calculation because to establish the true impact of any movement, one must calculate both the social costs and benefits and economic costs and benefits. The following aspects are highlighted in this lesson: magnitude of migration, economic consequences of migration, demographic consequences of migration, social consequences of migration, environmental consequences of migration, health consequences of migration and the political consequences of migration. The first aspect is about the magnitude of migration. Migration in India is predominantly short distance, with around 60% of migrants changing their residence within their district of birth and 20% within their state province, while the rest move across the state boundaries. The total migrants as per the census of 1971 are 161 million persons. In 1981 census 230 millions. In 1991 census 232 millions and 2001 census 315 millions. As per the census of the year 1991, nearly 20 million people migrated to other states seeking livelihood. Within a decade, the number of interstate migration doubled to 411,66,265 persons as per the census figures of 2001. It is estimated that at present around 5.5 million Indians are working in the oil exporting countries of Middle East and another 2 millions in the developed world. 92% of the domestic workers are women, girls and children, and 20% of these females are under 14 years of age, as per a study conducted by an organization called Social Alert. There is a perceptible phenomenon in this migration, that is, the tremendous increase of human workers migrating either individually or in groups to find work. Consequences of migration are as varied and diverse as its causes. Migration affects both the areas of origin of migration and areas of destination of the migrant population. Most commentators argue that the net effects of migration are generally positive. Over and above, the people are affected in a number of ways. The consequences of migration can be broadly grouped as the following. The first one is economic consequences of migrations. Migration can have significant effects on economies. Migration has impacts on the economies that people live and those in which they resettle. These effects vary with different types of migration, the skills of the migrants and the lengths of the time involved. The economic effects of migration vary widely. Sending countries may experience both gains and losses in the short term, but may stand to gain over the longer term. For receiving countries, temporary programs help to address skill shortages, but may decrease domestic wages and add to public welfare burden. While every mouth brings a pair of ants, these ants sometimes make more than they eat and sometimes less, noted a writer in the Financial Times. There are positive and negative economic consequences of migration. Next, we study positive consequences of migration. The Economist magazine claimed that loosening restrictions on labor migration would be one of the fastest ways in boost global economic growth. The positive effects, they say, would be significantly greater than removal of any trade barriers. For developed countries, the positive gains from immigration are a result of the infusion of cheap and eager labor into the economy. In the United States and Canada, migrant workers often fill low-wage jobs for which there is not enough local supply of labor, such as farm labor. Just as cheap imports of industrial goods benefits the American economy, migrants frequently transfer a considerable part of their income to their families at home. According to UN estimates, these transfers amount to over $20 billion annually. This corresponds to approximately one-third of the funds spent by industrialized countries on global development aid. With their money, the immigrants help to alleviate the poverty in their countries of origin in the short term. Private financial contributions improve the purchasing power of the families receiving them, but generally have little influence on the development of structures that would facilitate sustainable change. The expulsion of descendants has an adverse effect on social development. The remittance or the payments sent by migrants to their homes help in the growth of economy of the region. This money is mainly used by the family for purchasing food, repayment of debts, medical treatment, marriages, children education, purchasing agricultural inputs, construction of houses, etc. Many poor villages of Bihar, Uttar Pradesh depend on this money for their survival. Similarly, remittance from the international Indian migrants are one of the major source of foreign exchange in India. In 2002, India received 11 billion US dollars as remittance from these people. States such as Punjab, Kerala and Tamil Nadu receive very large amount of money from their international migrants. Migration of people from Uttar Pradesh, Bihar to the rural areas of Punjab, Haryana has resulted in the success of Green Revolution and agricultural development in Punjab and Haryana. Next is the negative economic consequences. The Center for Immigration Studies, that is CIS, discounts the positive gains of immigration. One study states that Mexican immigrants have a generally negative economic effect on the United States. It claims that Mexican immigrants have caused a 5% reduction in wages for the poorest 10% of the American workforce. At the same time, impoverished immigrant households use social services at twice the rate of native born Americans. Developing countries can suffer from brain drain. Brain drain is the effect. This refers to the migration of skilled persons from the poor countries to the developed countries in search of better economic opportunities. For example, there are currently more American scientists and engineers working in the United States than there are in Africa, according to International Organization for Migration, a worldwide agency that assists migrants. In Zambia, immigration has reduced the number of practicing doctors from 1,600 a few years ago to a mere 400 today. According to the United Nations Populations Fund 2006 State of the World Population Report, Africa only retains 1.3% of the world's healthcare practitioners. Thus, despite having over a quarter of the world's tuberculosis cases and 64% of the total numbers of people infected with HIV, Africa only has an average a mere 1 nurse per 1000 people. Nearby in India, 1 lakh skilled technology workers are expected to leave in the next 3 years. Since it costs India about $20,000 per student to educate these individuals, India essentially will subsidize the rest of the world for $2 billion worth of technology education. Immigration leaves noticeable gaps in the countries of origin. The loss of well-trained and experienced specialists reduces a nation's chances of building up workable economic structures by its own efforts. People moving to a world with a better infrastructure and higher standard of living soon become used to the new conditions. Only few are prepared to accept the poorer conditions on return to their country of origin later. Next is the demographic consequences of migration. Migration brings about changes in the characteristics of population in both the regions, that is the region of out-migration and the region of in-migration. Migration may have profound effects on the size, structure and growth patterns of populations. Migration has effects on both the populations of the places that people live and on the populations of those in which they settle. These effects vary with different types of migration and the length of migrants. There are both positive and negative consequences. Next is positive demographic consequences. Migration leads to the redistribution of the population within a country. It results in balanced distribution of people according to resources. Rural-urban migration is one of the important factors contributing to the population growth of cities. Next is the negative demographic consequences. Unregulated migration to the metropolitan cities of India has caused overcrowding. Development of slums in industrially developed states such as Maharashtra, Gujarat and Delhi is the result of unregulated migration. The underdevelopment gets even worse due to out-migration of skilled people. Migration changes not only the age and sex composition of population, but also affects the rate of growth of population. Generally, the proportion of old, children and females increased in population of source areas due to migration. On the other hand, the proportion of these people in the population of receiving areas is generally lowered. It results in the imbalances in sex composition due to selective male or female migration. This happens because it is mostly the youthful male population which is involved in migration. This leads to change in rates of fertility, mortality and consequently in the growth of population. The source regions are depleted of the youthful population and this result in lowered rates of births and comparatively lower rates of growth. An inverse impact is observed in case of the population structure of the receiving areas. Rural areas face shortage of skilled people because most of skilled and semi-skilled people migrate to urban areas. The cost of providing new and necessary infrastructure such as electricity, water, sewage disposal and road improvement places pressures on government spending because many of those who go to live in town are not employed and do not pay taxes. The government cannot offset these infrastructure costs against increased revenue from growing urban population. Next is the social consequences of migration. Migration may have impact on the cultures and societies. Migration also has effects on the cultures of both the places that migrants live and those in which they resettle. These effects vary with different types of migration and the lengths of time involved. There are positive and negative social consequences of migrations. First is the positive social consequences of migration. Migrants act as agents of social change. The new ideas related to new technologies, family planning, girls' education, etc. get spread from urban to rural areas through them. Migration also leads to intermixing of people from diverse cultures and results in the evolution of composite culture and enrichment. The mindset of the people changes, they start thinking broadly and the narrow views changes. Next is the negative social consequences. It also causes anonymity, which creates social vacuum and sense of dejection among individuals. Continued feeling of dejection may motivate people to fall in the trap of antisocial activities like crime and drug abuse. The emigration of skilled and knowledgeable people has resulted in a loss of potential leadership and left families and villages without strong, well informed people to take over from the existing leaders. The people who are free to live without assistance from their kin may limit contact with their families and villages and use their money and resources to look after themselves and their own nuclear families. Migration affects the women more. In the rural areas, male selective out-migration, leaving their wives behind, puts extra physical as well as mental pressure on the women, which increases their vulnerability. Migration has caused nearly 1 million married women in Kerala to live away from their husbands. Most of these women, the so-called Gulf wives, had experienced extreme loneliness to begin with, but they got increasingly burdened with the added family responsibilities with the handling of which they had little acquaintance so long as their husbands were with them. Next is environmental consequences of migration. There are environmental consequences of migrations. First is the positive environmental consequences. When people move around, they will gain knowledge about the cleanliness, health, and they will try to adopt in their hometown. Negative environmental consequences. Overcrowding of people due to rural urban migration has put pressure on the existing social and physical infrastructure in the urban areas. This ultimately leads to the unplanned growth of urban settlement and the formation of slums, shanty colonies. Apart from this, due to over-exploitation of natural resources, cities are facing the acute problem of depletion of groundwater, air pollution, and disposal of sewage and management of solid waste. Next is the health consequences of migration. The relationship between migration and health is a complex one. It operates in both the directions and is mediated by socio-political factors, environment, and disease exposure. The relationship can produce either positive or negative effects on both the migrant, him or herself, as well as on other family and household members. In order to explore migration as a risk factor, information is needed on the type of migration and the reasons for it. Factors in both the sending and receiving communities, including political, socio-economic, cultural, and environmental factors, disease prevalence, dietary and lifestyle factors, and the integrity or fragmentation of social networks. In most cases, the patterns of illness simply change with migration. Migration can have an impact on the health of the places that migrants live and those to which they move. Positive health consequences. On the positive side, movements result in better physical and mental health and longer life for migrants as a consequence of diet changes, access to better health services, and safer work. A move for work is likely to result in increased income and hence better nutrition and ability to access health care. Education may be more readily available, results in the knowledge of the health and nutrition. Next is the negative health consequences. Temporary circular migration leads to family breakdown, fragmentation of social networks, and psychosocial stress. Extended sexual networks result in sexually transmitted infections, including HIV, which affect temporary migrants themselves as well as their permanent partners residing in the sending communities. Temporary female migration, while increasing household income through remittance, results in the need for alternative child care arrangements. Children may experience neglect following migration of their mothers. New emerging infectious diseases, as is currently the case with severe acute respiratory syndrome, that is SARS, can spread rapidly across the globe due to extensive international cross-border level. In situations of forced migration, whether internal or cross-border, populations are often vulnerable and are at added risk. Forced migration can be consequent on conflict and war, political or religious persecution, economic hardship, famine, and other natural disorders. Populations forced to migrate may be compromised by the experience precipitating their flight. These may include violence and psychosocial stress, lack of food, and breakdown of health services. Their mental and physical state at time of departure, the length and difficulty of their journey, and conditions at their destination will all impact on the health of forced migrants. Exposure to new pathogens in the host community, together with the overcrowding, poor nutrition, and inadequate health care, can result in epidemic outbreaks. In 1994, an outbreak of cholera among Rwandan refugees in Goma, Eastern Zaire, resulted in an estimated 12,000 deaths. Movement of populations from non-malaria areas to destinations with endemic malaria results in high morbidity and mortality burden consequent on the absence of natural immunity. Next is the political consequences. Migration can have an impact on politics in both the places which people live and those to which they move. Governments will have to make policies to attract migrants, to pursue migrants to return or to limit migration to ensure that they have access to skills that they need. These political effects vary with different types of migration. Next is the positive political consequences. As the migrant people return to their hometown, they carry considerable experience of how politics, business and government services are organized overseas, and very clear ideas about how politics, business and government services should be organized in their hometown, and they may have an active interest in entering politics to put these things into place in their hometown. Next is the negative political consequences. People after their migration may lose interest in the politics of their place of origin. Lastly, I conclude by saying that migratory trends may have some beneficial demographic, social and economic effects if returns are carefully planned, prepared, conducted and supported. There should be a considerable strengthening of relations between countries, effective cooperation and solidarity and a shouldering of joint responsibility so as to define the correct policies for harmonious and more balanced world economic development. Thank you.